In November 1893, winter descended on Pine Creek Basin nearly 3 weeks earlier than usual, and no one in the valley suspected that the most memorable story of that winter would begin with the placement of a stove. At an elevation of about 5,800 feet, nighttime temperatures quickly dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with north winds blowing steadily at 35–40 miles per hour, the cold seeping into every log crevice as a familiar rule. The pine log cabin of the Reed family, built the previous summer, was constructed to true frontier standards, 12 feet carved, 14 feet in size, 7.5 feet high, with walls about 6 in thick and a sod-covered roof nearly 10 in deep. In that cabin lived 17-year-old Thomas Reed with his mother, Margaret Reed, 42 years old, a widow since the winter of 1891 when her husband died of pneumonia. The cast-iron stove, weighing nearly 180 pounds, was placed against the north wall, with a 6-in diameter steel stovepipe running straight up to the roof, a setup no one questioned. But after just a few of the first cold nights, Thomas noticed a clear paradox. When the stove was burning strongly, the thermometer hanging near the ceiling read only 76–78 degrees Fahrenheit, while near the floor the temperature was just 31–33 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough for water to form a thin skim of ice. Each day they burned 60–70 pounds of wood, yet the floor remained cold, hot air accumulated up high, and the woodpile depleted faster than expected. For Thomas, the problem was no longer about not burning hot enough, but about the heat being in the wrong place. In that space of just over 160 FTD, the stove against the wall meant most of the heat was absorbed by the wall and lost outside, while the rest rose to the ceiling, neglecting the living area below. His next thought was something almost taboo in Pine Creek Basin. What if the stove were placed in the middle of the cabin, right in the center of the floor, where heat could radiate evenly in all directions, even if it meant losing floor space and running the stovepipe horizontally before it went up through the roof? For a 17-year-old boy to think of that was akin to admitting that the correct way might not be enough to survive. But as he watched the woodpile dwindle and remembered his father's death, Thomas understood that this winter allowed no room for clinging to the familiar, and from that paradox, an idea considered wrong began to take shape. The heating system Thomas Reed was using in the Pine Creek Basin cabin was not the result of an individual decision, but the product of decades of accumulated experience among people living in the mountain west of the United States, a layout that had become the default. In most cabins in the Idaho Territory, Montana, or Wyoming in the late 19th century, the heating stove was always placed against one wall, usually the north or west wall, where there were fewer windows, and it was convenient for the stovepipe to run straight up to the roof. This approach was considered reasonable for several obvious reasons. It took up minimal floor space in an already cramped area, leaving the central floor for beds, the dining table, and essential activities. It allowed the stovepipe to go straight up, reducing the risk of soot buildup in horizontal sections and providing stable draft. It kept the stove away from main walkways, minimizing collisions and the danger of spilling hot ashes. For those building cabins in late summer, when time was short before winter, this was an easy-to-implement solution, with few errors, and most importantly, one that had been proven by previous generations. A cabin could be erected in a few weeks with available materials, and its owner had reason to believe they were fully prepared for the coming cold. Thus, this traditional heating system was trusted not because it was optimal, but because under normal conditions, it was usually enough to prevent people from freezing to death. When winters were not too long, when wood was plentiful around the cabin, and human strength was sufficient to chop daily, a stove against the wall could create a localized warm zone sufficient for cooking, melting ice in water buckets, and keeping occupants alive through the night. The problem only arose when those conditions were no longer normal, and the winter of 1893 in Pine Creek Basin was anything but normal. At nearly 5,800 feet elevation, where nighttime temperatures regularly fell below 10 degrees Fahrenheit and persisted for months, the physical limitations of this design revealed themselves mercilessly. A hot cast-iron stove radiates heat in all directions, but when placed against a wall, a large portion of that energy transfers directly into the 6-in thick logs behind it. Wood can absorb heat briefly, but with the large temperature difference between the cabin interior and the 18 degrees Fahrenheit outdoor air, most of that heat quickly conducts through the wall and dissipates outside, turning the wall into a surface for energy loss. The remaining heat entering the living space faced another issue. Hotter air is lighter and rises to the 7.5 feet ceiling, where it accumulated at 75-80 degrees Fahrenheit, while the air at knee height and floor level hovered around 31-33 degrees Fahrenheit. The result was extreme thermal stratification, where a person could feel their face burning hot when standing near the stove, but their toes remained numb in boots that never fully dried from November to March. Under those conditions, the only solution tradition offered was to burn the fire hotter. But a hotter fire meant consuming more wood, and that amount quickly exceeded what a small family could manage. Records from mountain regions show that a cabin with a wall-placed stove could burn 4 to 5 cords of wood per month during the deepest cold, equivalent to thousands of pounds of wood that had to be chopped, split, and hauled through 2-3 feet of snow. For Thomas, this was not just a theoretical figure. Each cord of wood represented 10-12 hours of grueling labor in biting wind, with an axe slippery from ice, unstable footing, and the ever-present risk of injury. Many people in the area did not die from freezing outright in their cabins, but from exhaustion while trying to maintain that fire day after day. They were injured while chopping wood, suffered frostbite when sweat froze on their shirt backs, contracted pneumonia from repeatedly moving between outdoor cold and stifling indoor heat, or succumbed to smoke poisoning when desperately sealing every crack to retain warmth. Those deaths were rarely named for their true cause, but their root lay in the inefficiency of the heating system. Nevertheless, almost no one dared to consider change. In an environment where mistakes could cost lives, tradition was not just habit but a form of psychological insurance. People trusted what their forebears had done, because those methods had allowed survival up to the present. Any different design, especially one contradicting accepted safety principles, was seen as reckless or foolish. A stove in the middle of the house evoked fire hazards. A horizontal stovepipe was considered a soot trap, and stones placed around the stove were thought to draw cold into the cabin. At that time, the failure of the traditional heating system was not recognized as a design flaw, but as an inevitable price of mountain life. And this acceptance obscured the reality that the problem lay not in the people or the winter, but in a design optimized for normal conditions, yet forced to operate in the worst circumstances. When the numbers for temperature and wood consumption left Thomas Reed no room for further delay, the decision that many later called a mistake took shape, not as a grand idea or a declaration against tradition, but as a pure survival reflex of someone who had seen the limits of the old way all too clearly. Thomas did not start by thinking about breaking rules. He started by looking around the 12-feet Gawker 14-feet cabin on a windy evening, when the stove was roaring but the floor was still so cold that steam from the dishwashing basin rose and frosted on the floorboards. The 180-pound cast-iron stove was placed against the north wall, exactly where everyone put it, but Thomas realized it was warming the wall more than the two people in the room. In his mind, if the stove was the only heat source, pressing it against the edge of the space was like burning a fire at the edge of a tent in a snowstorm. The decision to move the stove to the center of the cabin was thus more instinctive than theoretical. He wanted the heat closer to the people, not closer to the wall. To do that, Thomas had to break nearly every safety norm he had ever heard. The stove was not only pulled away from the wall but placed near the center of the room, where everyone believed the fire risk was greatest. To reduce danger, he raised the stove on an 8-inch-high stone platform, built from granite rocks gathered along Pine Creek, each weighing 20-30 pounds, with the total mass of the platform and surrounding stacked layers exceeding 400 pounds. 3 sides of the stove were enclosed by stone, not for shielding, but to create a solid mass capable of absorbing and retaining heat. The most controversial decision was the stovepipe. Instead of going straight up through the roof right behind the stove, Thomas ran the 6-inch diameter steel pipe horizontally, nearly 7.5 feet under the ceiling, before bending it upward, a section that any adult in the valley would call a soot trap. Every detail in this design went against what tradition taught, because tradition prioritized simplicity, directness, and minimizing localized risks, while Thomas, without naming it, was inadvertently optimizing for an overall system. What opponents failed to realize was that the old rules were built to avoid rare but catastrophic accidents, like house fires, while overlooking a far more common and insidious danger, energy loss leading to exhaustion and slow death over a long winter. When the stove was placed in the center, radiant heat from the hot cast-iron surface no longer struck a cold wall directly, but radiated evenly in all directions, reaching the room's air, human bodies, the wooden floor, and the stone mass surrounding it. Heat in this case required no complex theory to understand. Thomas simply saw that standing anywhere in the cabin no longer meant feeling one side scorching hot and the other freezing cold. Air convection, a concept he had never learned, began working in an intuitive way. Hot air from the stove rose to the ceiling, but because the heat source was in the middle of the room, this flow was not trapped in a corner, but spread evenly, sliding along the ceiling before descending along the walls, creating a slow circulation loop. The result was a significant reduction in thermal stratification. The ceiling no longer reached 78 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor barely rose a few degrees. Instead, floor temperature increased to about 45–48 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to prevent water from freezing overnight, while the ceiling dropped to 65–68 degrees Fahrenheit, more comfortable and with less loss. The role of the stones, which many believed would draw cold, became the key factor. The 3–4-inch thick stone mass around the stove absorbed heat when the fire burned strongly, reaching surface temperatures of 150–200 degrees Fahrenheit, then released it slowly over many hours after the flames died down. In this way, the stones acted as a crude thermal battery, smoothing out the peaks and valleys typical of a bare cast iron stove, where temperature fluctuated wildly with each load of wood. Even the horizontal stovepipe, the most criticized feature, played a role Thomas had not anticipated. With a length of nearly 8 feet and a surface area over 10 frid, this section maintained temperatures of 300–400 degrees Fahrenheit for hours, radiating additional energy into the living space before the smoke escaped, turning what was seen as a hazard into a passive heat exchanger. All these elements combined did not create a cabin that was hotter in the usual sense, but a more stable one, where temperature fluctuated less and energy was used more efficiently. The clearest result was in the woodpile behind the house. Instead of 60–70 pounds of wood per day, consumption dropped to about 35–40 pounds, extending the wood supply from a few weeks to nearly 2 months. This was not just an improvement in comfort but a life or death change, because every pound of wood not chopped and hauled was strength preserved for the next day. Thomas's design was considered wrong because it challenged fears deeply ingrained in the community, but precisely because it was not bound by rules formed under different circumstances, it was better suited to the reality Pine Creek Basin faced in the winter of 1893. The question many later asked was not why Thomas dared to do something different, but why a design that clearly retained heat better, reduced loss and stabilized temperature had been overlooked for so long. And the answer lies in the fact that tradition is often built to avoid rare mistakes, while survival in high mountain winters depends on minimizing small repeated losses each day, losses that only a design wrong by old standards could thoroughly resolve. But just as the new design began to take effect in that small cabin, Thomas Reed encountered another limitation, not from physics or the weather, but from his own social standing in the Pine Creek Basin community. At 17, Thomas was not considered a full man. He owned no land of his own, had never independently survived a complete winter, and in the eyes of the older residents who had lived in the valley for decades, Thomas was still just a boy acting on instinct. When they saw the stove placed in the middle of the cabin, the stones stacked around the fire, and the horizontal stovepipe running under the ceiling, what they saw was not a more efficient system, but a series of choices that went against everything they had been taught was safe. Thomas's age caused his observations to be dismissed from the start. When he said the floor no longer froze in the morning, people attributed it to a rare spell of milder weather. When he mentioned the clear reduction in wood consumption, they credited it to a change in wind direction, or less snowfall. The numbers, the small but daily repeated differences, lacked the weight to compete with experience accumulated over many winters and passed down as a form of truth. In that community, knowledge did not exist in the form of measurements or comparisons, but in the collective memory of accidents and losses, especially stories of cabins burning down because of improperly placed stoves or people suffocating from non-standard stovepipes. Those stories formed an invisible barrier, causing every new idea to be viewed through the lens of the worst possible risk. Thomas was not required to dismantle his design, but no one asked him why it worked or what exactly he had changed. That silence carried a particular weight, as it affirmed that he lacked the authority to be right, even though the reality inside his cabin said otherwise. For Thomas, this was not just disappointment, but a clear psychological pressure to continue believing in what he observed, while surrounded by a value system that regarded age and inherited experience as the sole measure of correctness. The conflict did not erupt into open arguments, but it simmered in every glance adults gave the central stove before turning away. in every half-joking remark about not copying the kid, and right there the heating problem transcended the technical realm, becoming a quiet confrontation between two approaches to knowledge, one inherited and protected by social authority, the other personal intuition formed from direct observation in specific circumstances. Thomas stood between them, forced to choose between trusting what had long been accepted and trusting what was keeping his cabin warmer through each cold night. And that tension turned a technical decision into a socially and psychologically charged coming-of-age challenge, where the cost of being seen as knowing more than the adults was not just ridicule, but the responsibility to bear the consequences if winter proved him wrong. As December passed, the wood stacked on the west side of the cabin dwindled faster than any optimistic calculation Thomas had used to reassure himself. The logs cut in late fall, piled nearly 5 feet high and over 12 feet long, originally estimated to last 2 months, were now less than half gone with winter only in its early stage. Nighttime temperatures consistently held at 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and valley-crossing winds made it feel another 10 degrees Fahrenheit colder. In the early days, Thomas could still select wood within a half-mile radius of the cabin, but by late December, the accessible dead-standing trees had been exhausted. To get wood, he had to go farther, crossing slopes covered in 24 inches of snow, where every step took twice the effort and every slip carried real injury risk. Some mornings, Thomas left the cabin before dawn, with the outdoor thermometer at 12 degrees Fahrenheit, pulling a sled loaded with 80 pounds of wood, and returned as the sun was low, his shirt back soaked in sweat that quickly froze when he paused to rest. Each trip took not just time but endurance. He had little margin to lose. Meanwhile, his mother Margaret Reed's health became an increasingly evident concern. Dry coughs appeared more frequently, especially at night when cabin temperatures fluctuated sharply, and sometimes she had to sit up for hours to breathe easier. Thomas realized that although the new design had improved thermal stability, every small mistake, a fire left to burn too low too long, an evening without adding wood in time, could let cold air in and quickly worsen her condition. The problem now was no longer optimization or experimentation, but maintaining stability amid dwindling resources. Winter still had at least 2 months ahead, and Pine Creek Basin history allowed no illusions about the weather showing mercy. Thomas knew that if wood continued depleting at this rate, even with the more efficient design, they would face a point where continuous heating became impossible. He also knew that each farther trip for wood meant exponentially higher risk. Breaking a leg 2 miles from the cabin in sub-zero temperatures was nearly a death sentence. That pressure weighed on every daily decision, turning routine tasks into cold survival calculations. Looking at the thinning woodpile and his mother's weary face in the weak golden firelight, Thomas understood they had passed the point of no return. Winter was no longer a challenge adjustable by small changes, but a series of days where each decision either kept the cabin warm one more night or pushed them closer to exhaustion and illness. That realization closed off any possibility of reverting to what was considered standard, because continuing the old way meant burning more wood and shortening their holdout time. But that impasse also opened another boundary, where Thomas had no room left for trial and error mistakes. Any further failure would not be just a lesson but a price too high to pay. And it was precisely when that pressure reached a point where delay was impossible that Thomas Reed made the decision most people in Pine Creek Basin later called a mistake, at least at the time it was made. There were no drawings, no guidebooks, no adults standing beside him to confirm that what he was about to do was reasonable or safe. All Thomas had were long evenings observing the fire, mornings placing bare feet on the cold floor to feel temperature differences, and the undeniable fact that if things continued as they were, they would not have enough wood to last the winter. On a morning in early January 1894, with outdoor temperature at 16 degrees Fahrenheit and steady wind from the northwest, Thomas began dismantling the cast-iron stove from its position against the cabin's north wall. The nearly 180-pound stove required him to use wooden levers and took nearly an hour just to shift it a few feet away from the wall, sweat pouring despite the still cold cabin air. He raised the stove by stacking flat stones gathered from the creek bank the previous summer, creating a platform about 8 inches high, not because he knew it would improve anything, but because he needed space for the stovepipe to run horizontally before exiting the roof. Then Thomas stacked larger rocks around 3 sides of the stove, leaving the front open where the firebox door was, accepting that from now on the cabin would literally revolve around this fire source. When he installed the nearly 7 feet horizontal steel stovepipe section under the ceiling, hanging it with crude wire from the roof beams, Every action carried the feeling of going against every warning story he had ever heard. No one in the valley had taught him this was right. On the contrary, collective memory said horizontal stovepipes were dangerous, prone to soot buildup and fire. But Thomas had no other choice, because centering the stove while keeping a straight vertical pipe was impossible. When he finished the installation and lit the first fire in the new setup, there was no moment of triumph or clear certainty, only prolonged tension as he sat watching every small fire reaction, every sound of expanding metal, every smoke flow through the pipe. News of the change spread faster than Thomas expected. A few men stopped by, standing at the cabin doorway looking in, their eyes mixing curiosity and skepticism. Some shook their heads, saying he was turning the house into a fire trap. Others half smiled, suggesting a fatherless boy was panicking and acting recklessly. No one directly stopped him, but the whispers and looks were enough to confirm that in the community's eyes, Thomas had crossed the allowed boundary of experimentation. What made this decision special was not its boldness, but the circumstances forcing it. Thomas was not seeking difference or trying to prove anything. He acted because each longer cold night meant his mother coughed more, because each wasted log brought them closer to having nothing left to burn. In the early days, Thomas barely slept through the night, waking multiple times to check the stovepipe, touching the stone slabs to ensure they weren't too hot, listening for any unusual sound. The fear of error was ever present, because if this design failed, consequences would come not as a technical lesson, but as fire, smoke, or uncontrolled cold. But in that tension, Thomas shifted the entire story to a new phase. From the moment he personally moved the stove and accepted the mocking looks of those around him, the question was no longer whether the design was standard, but whether it was good enough to keep the two people in that cabin alive one more day. Winter quickly assumed the role no debate in Pine Creek Basin could replace, becoming the cold, impartial test of every decision Thomas Reed had made. In mid-January 1894, a strong northern storm system moved in, bringing continuous snow for 6 straight days, adding 10 to 14 in each day, burying the trail out of the valley under over 5 feet of snow. Gusts reached 45 miles per hour, blowing snow to cover the cabin's only small window, and in rare lulls between gusts, the surroundings became eerily silent. Nighttime temperatures during the storm held at 22 to 27 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes lower, with no sign of early relief. In those conditions, Thomas and his mother's cabin was nearly completely isolated, unable to receive outside help, and every prior calculation had to face reality. Other cabins in the valley built to true frontier standards began showing familiar but more severe problems than ever. People had to keep fires burning day and night to prevent air from freezing. Ceilings grew so hot that moisture condensed and froze into thin ice, while floors remained cold enough for bucket water to freeze solid in hours. Many families piled extra blankets on beds and took turns sleeping near the stove, as cabin corners became uninhabitable. News traveled slowly in the storm, but Thomas still heard that some woodpiles were depleting faster than expected, and several men had to go out in the blizzard for more wood, each trip carrying the risk of not returning. Meanwhile, inside the small cabin on the valley edge, the new design began showing clear differences without need for explanation. The thermometer hung at chest height recorded steady temperatures around 52–55 degrees Fahrenheit through the night, even when the stove fire was banked low from midnight to morning. More importantly, floor temperature no longer dropped below 38–40 degrees Fahrenheit, enough to keep water from freezing and allow Margaret Reed to step out of bed without lung-searing cold. The stones stacked around the stove retained noticeable warmth, radiating steadily for hours after Thomas's last wood load, and the horizontal stovepipe under the ceiling became a warm metal strip, helping spread heat throughout the space. In the coldest nights, when the wind howled outside and snow struck the cabin walls like sand, Thomas realized he no longer needed to wake up every 2 hours to add wood. One full load before bed, and another at dawn, was enough to keep the cabin temperature from falling into the dangerous zone. This difference did not come as excess comfort, but as stability, a rare and priceless thing in a high mountain winter. When the storm stretched into its 5th day, a few neighbors risked crossing the deep snow to check on Thomas and his mother. They entered the cabin expecting a stifling or dangerous space, but instead found a room with even temperature, neither too hot nor bitterly cold, and a woman sitting sewing near the fire without having to dodge harsh heat currents. No one needed to speak up in defense or explanation, because the thermometer readings, the remaining wood in the pile, and Margaret's stable health already said it all. After that prolonged storm, the atmosphere in Pine Creek Basin changed in a way that was hard to notice without paying close attention. The half-smiles and casual remarks about the wrongly placed stove gradually disappeared, not because anyone publicly admitted they were wrong, but because reality no longer allowed that ridicule to continue. When the snow settled and temporary paths were cleared, people began stopping by Thomas Reed's cabin with a completely different attitude. They no longer stood at the door shaking their heads as before, nor uttered ritual warnings. Instead came longer looks, slower steps when walking around the stone mass in the middle of the cabin, and the characteristic silence of people observing rather than judging. Questions emerged, at first hesitant, often disguised as social curiosity, whether nighttime temperatures held steady, how often he added wood, if the stones got too hot. Thomas answered with simple numbers and specific descriptions, not trying to convince anyone, just recounting what he had experienced during the storm days. That very calm made the follow-up questions more direct. A man who had mocked before asked if he could touch the stone slab near the stove, then stood still for a few seconds as if feeling the radiated heat. Another observed the horizontal stovepipe and asked about soot, not in a warning tone but as if considering a possibility. Skepticism did not vanish entirely, but it had changed form. It was no longer automatic rejection, but a series of practical questions arising from the need to understand something that was working better than what they were used to. In the evenings after the storm, when people gathered in warmer cabins to share news, the story of the central stove was no longer told as an anecdote about youthful recklessness, but as something strange worth thinking about. No one said Thomas was right, but no one said he was wrong anymore either. This silence carried a different meaning from before, as it opened a space where old assumptions no longer sufficed to fill it. Thomas noticed the change not through praise or formal recognition, but through the way people began looking at his design as a choice worth considering, rather than a mistake to avoid. The shift in attitude in Pine Creek Basin quickly led to concrete actions, though no one called it a revolution, or even admitted they were learning from a 17-year-old boy. The first to adjust his cabin was not a relative or friend of Thomas Reed, but a middle-aged man living in the southern part of the valley, where winter winds blew stronger and his woodpile had dropped to a worrying level. He did not copy the entire design, only pulled the stove about 3 feet away from the wall and stacked a few large rocks behind it, treating it as a temporary measure. But after just a week, he noticed more stable cabin temperatures and wood consumption reduced enough to extend his holdout time. This news spread not through declarations, but through short conversations between men meeting while chopping wood or repairing fences. Another cabin tried raising the stove on a lower stone platform, only about 5 in, to allow a shorter horizontal stovepipe before it went up the roof. Another family did not dare place the stove in the middle of the room, but they extended the in-cabin stovepipe section by a few feet to capture heat before venting outside. Each variation bore the mark of caution, but all pointed toward the same unnamed principle. Notably, the method spread without being attached to its author. No one said they were following Thomas Reed's way. In conversations, people said someone tried placing the stove in the middle, or heard that stones hold heat better. Thomas's name was rarely mentioned, and he did not seek to claim his role. What mattered more to the community was not who was right, but what helped them survive more easily through the remaining weeks of winter. By late February 1894, at least 5 cabins in the valley had made clear changes, and a few others began planning for the next winter. This spread happened quietly, almost invisibly, but it marked an important shift. An idea once seen as a personal mistake had now become a set of shared practices, adjusted and adapted to each specific situation. Thomas's story, accordingly, was no longer just about a reckless decision in a single cabin, but evidence of how a community could absorb a new solution when reality forced them to listen, even if they never publicly acknowledged its original source. When the winter of 1894 finally withdrew from Pine Creek Basin, what it left behind was not just muddy patches from melting snow or bare tree trunks after months of harvesting for firewood. The quiet changes in how cabins were heated began reshaping daily life in more sustainable ways. In Thomas Reed's cabin, the difference became clear as days warmed and the need for fire decreased. The woodpile still had a significant amount left, enough for late cold snaps in early April, and this brought a new sense of security, something rarely present before when winter ended. The cabin was no longer a space that had to constantly fight the cold, but a more stable place where temperatures did not fluctuate sharply and daily activities no longer revolved around constantly adding wood. In other valley cabins that had adopted variations of the new design, people noticed a clear reduction in fuel dependence. Time spent chopping and hauling wood in the following winter was cut, meaning less risk of injury and exhaustion. Women and children, who often suffered most from cabin temperature swings, could stay in more evenly warm, less smoky spaces, and this directly affected health throughout the year. More importantly, cabins gradually came to be seen not just as temporary shelters through the cold, but as structures that could be optimized for the harsh conditions the valley regularly faced. These improvements did not make life easy, but they created a greater safety margin, enough for people to plan for the next winter without being haunted by fears of running out of wood or sudden cold infiltration. Looking back, it was clear that the impact of the new design did not end with that severe winter. It persisted in how Pine Creek Basin residents thought about their living spaces, about the relationship between effort expended and safety achieved, and about the possibility of improving things long thought fixed. What remained after the snow melted was not an invention bearing someone's name, but a more practical approach to survival that would shape building and heating decisions for years to come. Many years after the winter in Pine Creek Basin, when memories of deep snow and biting wind had faded in daily life, the story of the centrally placed stove was still mentioned in a different way, no longer tied to skepticism or debate, but as a small slice showing how people learned to adapt in the harshest conditions. Looking back from the distance of time, what stood out was not the technical details of the design or who thought of it first, but the circumstances that forced a 17-year-old boy to question what was taken for granted. Tradition exists because it is effective in most situations, refined over generations to meet the normal conditions people usually encounter. But that winter was not normal conditions, and in such moments, absolute loyalty to tradition can become a dangerous limitation. Survival in the worst circumstances requires a different kind of optimization, not based on convenience or habit, but on clearly understanding the core problem and being willing to adjust everything around it. Thomas Reed's story is not a call to reject the experience of those who came before, but a reminder that experience is only truly valuable when it still fits the context. When the context changes, old solutions need to be re-examined, not with blind respect, but with clear-eyed observation. What makes Thomas's decision memorable is not that he was right from the start, but that he dared to take responsibility for an unaccepted choice, while the cost of being wrong was very real and very close. Over time, that story became a simple illustration of how real innovation happens not from grand ideas that are celebrated, but from small adjustments made when no safer choice remains. And that was the final message that winter left behind. That tradition is optimized for normal circumstances, but survival, in the worst times, requires people to optimize for the very harsh conditions they face, even if it means going against what was once considered right. If you find stories like this worth reflecting on, please subscribe to the channel to continue exploring those small moments where people change how they survive in the harshest conditions. Thank you for joining, and see you in the next story.